Welcome to Conversations with Tom Shorkey. Conversations explores the past, the present, and the future of the communities in which we live through the eyes of interesting individuals. Now let's join our host, Tom Shorkey.
Welcome to Conversations. I'm your host for today's program, Tom Shorkey. Our guest today is just a guy from the neighborhood in St. Clair. Many of you will, when you see our guest today, you go, oh yeah, I've seen him in Neiman's Market, maybe at the River Crab, maybe going into the Methodist Church in downtown St. Clair. But what a lot of our Blue Water area listeners don't realize is our guest today has won 4 Emmys, is a member of the National Hockey League Hall of Fame or the U.S. Hockey Hall of Fame as the first broadcaster and the only one to be in that organization. With us today is St. Clair resident Mike Doc Emrick.
Tom, it's good to be with you.
Welcome to the show today. Mike, before we start, let's get this organized. You go by Mike and you go by Doc. I know you have that legitimate doctorate from, was it Bowling Green University?
Yeah, they're trying to forget that back there, yeah. But
okay.
No, that's true. It was earned 40 years ago.
Wow.
Long time ago.
Well, don't tell anybody. They will
Okay.
never guess.
Yeah.
Mike, before we talk, and we'll probably talk a little bit of hockey, and for our audience at home, many of them will recognize your voice, if not your face, as the voice of the NBC Game of the Week. You've been with Versus. You've been with a couple different NHL teams. And probably we're going to talk a little bit of hockey today. But first, let's talk about where'd Mike Emrick grow up?
5'7". I don't think I ever did. I was raised in Indiana, central Indiana, and north central Indiana, if you were to take a line and draw it from Indianapolis straight to the Michigan border, it'd be about halfway. Lots of cornfields, and I got my first chance in radio at a town right in the middle of that line called Peru, Circus City, USA.
Really?
They had a daytime radio station that signed off at local sunset. And so I was the high school senior host of Sundown Serenade, music for when day is done. 6 o'clock until local sunset, which in July was 8:15. We played Jackie Gleason, Mantovani, anything that would put people to sleep. At 8:15, that was it. And then you shut the transmitter off, burned all the trash, went home. One night the field caught on fire. And that was the field that surrounded the tower. So there was a little bit of concern on the part of management as to how careful I'd been with the fire.
Great story. Growing up in Indiana, now that's not the hockey hotbed of the world. Growing up, was it baseball? Was it football? What tweaked your interest and directed you towards sports broadcasting?
Well, our town was 600 people. And it was the era of the movie Hoosiers. It was the 1950s, same era that was captivated, and accurately, I think, by Hoosiers. Small gyms with the band at one end and a wall at the other and the trophy case nearby. But it was baseball for me and my brother. Neither of us were too tall, so we weren't basketball players. And until I saw hockey live for the first time in 1960, baseball broadcasting was what I really wanted to do. But when I saw hockey live and I was able to listen to our games, our Fort Wayne team's games on the radio, I became hooked. And that was in 8th grade. I really wanted to be a hockey announcer. And for somebody from north central Indiana, that was a weird way to make a living.
So how did you progress then? Education, I think we talked, it was Manchester College, which is in Indiana.
Right.
Then you... somewhere along the way, it was Miami of Ohio and Bowling Green along the way. Was your focus communication, or was it?
It about had to be, because that was what I really wanted to do was broadcast hockey games. So I had to get a skill, and I had to do something while I was getting the skill. Well, part of that beyond high school was going to college, and I extended that because I didn't have any TV experience at all, so I went to Miami on a one-year master's program and was their sports guy on television down there. But at the same time, what I would do would be to go to Fort Wayne's Allen County Coliseum on a Wednesday night when they didn't sell out and sit in the corner with a recorder and do the game to myself, and then listen to it back, and go back there on another Wednesday and do another game. After I'd finished graduate school, I needed a job, and I sent letters to all the teams playing these phony hockey games as my audition tape, and they all sent nice letters back saying, thank you, but the job is filled, or we really don't think that we can use you. And so I got a job teaching speech and broadcasting at a small college in western Pennsylvania called Geneva. And then when I came back for Christmas vacation, I'd go to Fort Wayne and sit in the corner and record another hockey game. Well, the second year I was at Geneva, 35 miles from Pittsburgh, it seemed like the Penguins were there, and they didn't have a correspondent at the nightly daily newspaper nearby. So I went to the editor and said, I'll cover the Penguins for free if you get me a pass. And he said, sounds like a good deal to me. So I got in free, I paid my own gas, and they didn't have to pay anybody to cover the Penguins, and I got a byline, and I got to meet all these players. And it didn't get me a whole lot, but I realized after 2 years of teaching college that to make $600 more a year, I'd have to get an advanced degree, which I got at Bowling Green. They threw in the second period of the Falcon hockey broadcasts as part of my responsibility. So finally, I wasn't doing a game to myself, and after 2 years there, I had an audition tape that was legitimate, and I sent it around, and a station in Port Huron said, how about you come up and we'll talk about it.
Well, now, before we get to Port Huron, let's go back to Geneva just for a moment. Did I see, was that Beaver Falls?
That's correct.
And our audience at home probably doesn't realize that probably one of the most famous Super Bowl characters came from Beaver Falls.
He was 2 years removed from that Super Bowl by the time I hit town, and there were banners all over the place for Joe Willie Namath, because
Joe Willie Namath,
he had just turned the football world on its ear. He played for Beaver Falls High School and then went to Alabama. And as a matter of fact, one of the people I taught with was in an English class with Joe Willie, and he showed up for class.
Well,
I don't,
well, see,
it was a different time.
You were touching sports royalty before you even knew it.
Had no idea.
Well, you know, you bring up the Port Huron flags, and for our listeners, and if you've been in our community, you know, for the 30, 40 years, or if you're a lifelong St. Clair County resident, I mean, the Port Huron flags were near and dear to this population, to where I think they were more popular than the Red Wings, and Billy LaCane was probably more recognizable than Gordie Howe to people in our area. What did you do? How did the flag thing come about, and how long were you here?
I was here for 4 years, from 1973 to 77. The team arrived in 1962. John Wismer brought them here and had them for about 10 years before he turned them over to the city. And they were run as part of the McMorran Authority for another 10 years before they were eventually folded. And then other teams have come and gone since that time. But the thing about that era was that you mentioned the recognizability of players. They lived here year-round. They were not, the NHL was so far removed because there were only 6 teams at that time. And the phone wasn't going to ring for any of the flags tomorrow to join the Red Wings or the Blackhawks. It wasn't going to happen. So these guys recognized that this was their lot in life, and they were going to enjoy it. They put down roots here. And so Guy James lived here. Ray Germain lived across the bridge in Sarnia. You could name the players on the Marcel Goyette put down roots here. Players stayed here, and that meant in the summertime. Some of them played on community softball teams. And so it was then to a point that let's not go see the Flags play. Let's go see Guy's team play. Let's go see Ray's team play, Billy's team play. And that develops a fan following. When your guys unintentionally are creating a fan following just by being human beings in the community. And that was fantastic. It was a great era.
Well, and it's almost like, and we talked earlier, you were a big Pittsburgh Pirate fan growing up, but that's the way it was with baseball too back in the 40s and 50s. The salaries weren't out of sight. Guys played baseball for the season and then took an odd job for the 3 or 4 months until spring training. So, what did you do for the Flags?
I was a public relations guy and press relations and the broadcaster. And I realized that that was a lot of work, but it was fun work, and I enjoyed it all. It amounted to an 80-hour work week during the regular season, and in the summertime it was a normal job, 30 or 40 hours covering sports for the radio station and doing occasional promotions for the hockey team. But it was all fun, and it was all a part of what I really wanted to do in life. I'd finally gotten a chance to do it. And for $160 a week, I'd never had more money. Even teaching college didn't pay that well.
Okay, when you're doing the Flags, and you're behind that microphone, not with a tape recorder in the corner of Fort Wayne, but wasn't Fort Wayne an opponent of the Flag?
Yes.
Didn't that team then?
Yes.
The Comets, is that what they
Yeah,
did?
Fort Wayne Comets.
Yeah. And, I mean, did you think, well, this is where I'm going to be for the next 25 years? Or were you kind of thinking that maybe there are bigger fish to fry sometimes?
Well, the ambition that I think everyone had when they were my age was maybe I could be an NHL broadcaster someday, and that was my ambition too. It was partly enhanced by the fact that by that time in the mid-70s, the Flags were in danger of either leaving or folding every year. We had gotten into the mid-70s, the workman's compensation for players had gone up every year, and some of the larger cities in our league could handle it. The Muskegons and the Port Hurons were a little more stretched than the larger cities like Fort Wayne, and Kalamazoo was loaded with money. And so there was a challenge each year. One year, John Wismer and 2 other citizens in the community actually went and paid the workman's comp payment for the year. They divided it amongst the 3 of them, so that enabled the team to stay another year. So I realized that maybe this team wasn't going to be here forever. There was always the question mark in the summertime whether they would come back. So that probably spurred me on to do a lot more in sending out audition tapes and trying. And I latched onto a job with the Philadelphia Flyers farm team in Portland, Maine in 1977. And so that was the last that I worked in Port Huron, was after my 4th year here.
So then did you work your way up the Flyer organization, or were you in Maine?
Yeah, I was in Maine for 3 years, and the Flyers were just 2 years removed from their last Stanley Cup championship. And they had lots of money, and they believed in not only promoting from within, but they wanted, if they were starting a franchise, which they were in Maine, they wanted it to succeed. And so they put good players in, and the first 2 years we won the regular season and the playoff championship. That doesn't happen in minor league hockey very much, but they made sure that the team was good. And the 3rd year we got to the conference final before we lost. So there were some very good teams in Philadelphia that helped. The fact that they promoted from within took me to the NHL 3 years later from the time we started.
And then when you say you went to the NHL 3 years later, was it with the Flyers?
Right, it was with them.
Now, were you behind the mic yet, or were
yes.
you? Okay.
Yeah, the whole time. It was the same role that I had in Port Huron. It was the 3 jobs in Maine, and then when I went to Philadelphia, they already had a wonderful broadcaster in Gene Hart, but they had pay cable at home, similar to Pass, which was prominent here in Michigan. It was called Prism in Philadelphia. And so I was the pay cable home announcer. Gene would do the over-the-air games on the road, and he would do home radio. So the job was divided, and in addition to doing home play-by-play, I would divide road production, being the in-truck producer of the road games as well. So that was a great experience to learn what a production truck is like and how frantic it is during games.
When you have a role like that, and back then, where are we now? Early 80s or late 70s?
Yeah, it was the early 80s, 1980 to 83.
Do you just work the season then, or is that are you a full-time employee year-round, or how?
In Philadelphia, it was, yeah. It was 50 weeks. You got 2 weeks off in the summer. So we'd come back here, for my wife Joyce and I, who I met here, we would come back here for 1 week, we'd go to Indiana for 1 week, and then we'd go back and work for 50. And yeah, it was kind of longish because the Flyers were a good team, but they seemed to always hit the Rangers in the first round, and it was best of 5. and they got knocked out in 3 games. So Easter Sunday was the last game in April, and then you would have to go into the office every day and watch the rest of the playoffs and try to find something to do until the draft had taken place and you started to know who your players were going to be for the next year. So that was a little tricky.
And then at some point in there, speaking of Rangers, you segued to Madison Square Garden?
Yeah, Madison Square Garden.
How did that all come about?
Well, the former president of the Flyers moved to took over the job with the New Jersey Devils. And he had been the person implementing my move from Maine to Philadelphia. And so he certainly remembered me. And the guy that I worked with as a co-producer in Philadelphia had moved to Madison Square Garden. So 2 allies had been ex-Flyers employees. And we used to joke that someday they'll have a reunion of all the people that had left Philadelphia. But it would take a new stadium to hold them all. But anyway, they remembered me, and so I wound up being assigned to New Jersey Devils games and had that position until Madison Square Garden relinquished the rights after 3 years. They kept me on doing Rangers radio games that Marv Albert did not have time to do, and that was over half of them because he had so many other obligations.
Great. And then did the Devils actually play in Madison Square Garden, or
No.
they were across the river, weren't they, somewhere in?
Yeah, they were in the Meadowlands.
Yeah.
It was freaky because the Madison Square Garden network was under the umbrella, the same umbrella as the New York Rangers, and yet the New Jersey Devils, one of the Rangers' fiercest opponents, was one of their clients. And so it was freaky, but that was how things were done.
Those were big times, though, in the 80s and early 90s, I would
Yes.
think, with the Devils. I mean, did they win multiple titles, or did they just win the Cup the one time?
No, they defeated the Red Wings in 4 straight, sorry,
Yeah.
in 1995, and then they took Dallas out in 6 games in 2000. And then they went 7 against Mike Babcock, who was an up-and-coming young coach with what was then called the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim. They're now the Anaheim Ducks. In 7 games, the home team won all of the home games, and the Devils got the last game at home and beat them 3-0. And so that was the 3rd championship.
Great. And I noticed you have a little souvenir from...
Oh yes, this was the 3rd one. This was the Anaheim.
One of my questions I was going to ask you is, if you're an announcer and your team wins the Stanley Cup, do you get a ring? So obviously...
Yes, even
that
if you're not employed by the team, as it turned out, it all depends on whether the team feels good about you or not.
They vote, don't they? Who gets...
Well, yeah, Lou Lamoriello, the general manager, decided, we'll make sure the Madison Square Garden guys, so the producer and the director and all of us announcers got rings too. And those are a gift from the team. There's nothing that we really did to earn it because we were working for a different company, but they decided to cut us in on the loot. And those rings are appraised at about $35,000. So it was a nice gift for hanging on and just riding the coattails of a very good team.
And to that point, whether it was the Flags or whether it was the Flyers or the Devils, you kind of got the focus on one team, one organization, 30 guys come and go, and a couple of goaltenders here and there. But that didn't last forever, because somewhere along the way, you became a national broadcaster. How'd that work?
It was in the same vein, really, while it was still working for teams. ESPN had the rights in the late 80s, and the person who hired me in Maine, it's funny how this all sort of works, Gil Stein, was the president in Maine. He later became general counsel to the NHL. And he had, I think, convinced some people at the NHL network, how about you let this guy have 1 game? Just let him have 1 game. And so it was St. Louis and Chicago in 1986 at Old Chicago Stadium. And they had a very capable announcer named Ken Wilson, who also got wonderful work in baseball. When he got a full-time job doing the Cardinals in baseball, that removed him from the key time doing hockey games in the spring. And so they asked if I would be interested in doing the Stanley Cup playoffs and regular season on ESPN. And both the Rangers and Flyers, who I was working with at that time doing work to keep myself afloat, said, sure, go ahead and do that and do the games that you can for us. So I was very generous of them to allow me to do that, and I became ESPN's hockey announcer for a couple of seasons.
And
that was how that started.
That's how that started, and now you're the NBC game of the week. Is that the Wednesday game, or what's your schedule
Wednesday
now?
night rivalry, the night you love to hate.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
they give us matchups of teams that are fierce rivals, and the league gives us a very good schedule. And after the new year, it tends to be either Wednesday or Sunday afternoons, or some weeks it winds up being both. But it's I usually do about 55 games a year. At one time, it was 120 when I was doing both New Jersey games and NBC. But when I hit 65, I decided, what am I doing? Because you do 8 games in 10 days in 8 different cities, and to do the job right, you have to get there in time for the morning practices. So you're in line at the airport at 5 in the morning, and by the time you get to that 8th game, you realize this isn't going to be as good as the first one was, because you can't prepare adequately even though you went to practice. So it just seemed like that was enough, and NBC was more than happy to have me do their games full time over the last 5 years, and on a yearly basis as long as I want to do them, which is very nice. In network television, you don't get that option.
How many Stanley Cup finals have you been able to be behind the microphone for?
I'm not trying to be smart about this. I think it's 17 or 18. It's somewhere in there. And now the local broadcasters don't get to do Stanley Cup finals anymore, because for the last 21 years, that has belonged to national networks. So most of those were with the national networks. That first one I got to do with the Devils in 1995 was just a fluke. I was the Fox national guy, and the team I followed all year actually made it to the final and then actually won the final. So that was a fortunate break for me as the Devils announcer to be doing the national game on Fox. But yeah, I think it's closing in on 20.
Now, when you do the final, do you just do the finals? Is everything up to the finals, the local broadcasters?
The first round only.
Oh, first round only.
Yeah, and then the second round we share.
Okay.
And then the third and fourth rounds are exclusively belong to the networks now. So with each contract, there's been more money involved, and so more has been included in the network package. So I believe it's the first round is strictly local, and we're allowed to do games, but we can't bump them. And then the second round is pretty much us, and the third and fourth rounds are exclusive now. And you understand how the broadcasters locally feel about that, because they're with their team all year long. And the radio guys continue, of course, but at the time that you really are excited about your team, you're not able to do that. And having been on the other side, I know how that is. So usually we will try to mention the local TV announcers at some point during the Stanley Cup final, because they are important, their fans miss them, and there's nothing that you can do to replace that.
But I do think that the enthusiasm factor, and I was listening to Dan Patrick's show a couple of weeks ago, and I think it was Chris Collingsworth. He was talking to one of the football play-by-play or color guys, and they said, well, how do you maintain your enthusiasm? And he was very complimentary to you. He said, if we could all be like Mike Emrick, because it doesn't matter if Mike's doing preseason in October, the first part of the year in November, or the Stanley Cup finals, that enthusiasm is there. And I think that's nice for people to hear, because when you don't get Mickey Redmond and a few of the others, Red Wings, the enthusiasm is at that microphone. And if I would tell our listeners, if you wanted to Google one thing, do the Stanley Cup final highlights of Mike's, because they have a series, and there must be 30 or 40 goals in there of Stanley Cup games that are tied or overtime or whatever. And the enthusiasm with which you pound that he scores is it doesn't matter which team it was. It is like you were the hometown guy making that call. So, and I think that you know, attests and affirms to, you know, your abilities behind the mic. But before we leave NHL, you've seen them all, and especially being the National, you've the Crosbys and the Ovechkins and the Datsuks. Were you around? Did you do any Wayne Gretzky? Was he still in? Mm-hmm. And they call, you know, as we like to say, Gordie Howe, Mr. Hockey, but Gretzky was the greatest. What really separates those superstars? I mean, what do they have that just sets them apart from the other guys in the league?
It's an interesting question, Tom. You know, I've asked coaches that this year in particular, because I wondered what it was like to coach an elite player that has abilities that no one else on the team has. And one coach told me, he said, it's really easy because you realize you don't have to teach them anything. Another coach said it's a challenge because the frustration level of an elite player can be very quick and very high because they're used to everything happening really well for them, and maybe their line mates are not as skilled as they are. So it's a challenge from either direction. But what makes them, a lot of it is genetics. A lot of it is what happens in their early years, how much they get to play, who they get to play with, where they wind up going. Even guys that are born in California can become NHL players. A lot of times they wind up going north of the border to play. But now there's so many places that guys can go to play, and they don't have to leave home very far to do it, to become world-class players. But I think when you're talking about somebody like Howe, like Orr, like Gretzky, like Crosby, you're talking about someone who was extremely gifted and developed that gift at a very early age. Sid's first interview, I think he was 9. His first interview that he did was 9. Gretzky probably the same thing. Why? Because they wound up on a very big stage and were accorded a lot of potential for the future of being great early. Now, all the guys I mentioned were Canadian, and the Canadian media tends to follow a hockey player much quicker than the media across this country does. We'll follow a basketball or a baseball player or a football player a lot more quickly, but the northern media tends to follow hockey players a little more quickly. Now that whole context is changing because we do have players from Arizona and Florida in the NHL now. That process will change as time passes, but more of these world-class players that will always be icons in the sport, the 4 that I mentioned, who are also ambassadors, and probably the 4 best ambassadors that I've mentioned, that I've seen in the sport.
And it is amazing when the game's on the line, that's the person who just happens to have the puck.
Somebody in Pittsburgh asked me some of the great highlights I could remember. I said, you know, recently Sid's been in all of them. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is his team gets to the final, he plays in the Olympics, and he winds up with important things happening when he's out there. I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, but that's fine. And he's the guy that gets booed the loudest. Whoop, you lost your mic.
Right.
I think we're still okay. And he's the guy that gets booed the loudest at the Joe Louis Arena.
That's right. In other cities, it's roster envy, they call it.
Yeah.
They'd love to see him in a winged wheel.
Yes. Who are 2 or 3 of the old hockey announcers that come to mind when you think of somebody who really did it right?
The guy that made a big difference in my life was just laid to rest last week in Fort Wayne, Bob Chase. He did the comments for 63 years. He was the guy I listened to growing up, and he was doing the comments late last season and was scheduled to do them this fall before he became ill. He used English well. He was more partial, I think, to the comments than I would be were I doing it, but that was my choice and that was his. Mm-hmm. But he used English well. Danny Gallivan, who was the Montreal Canadiens and CBC voice for a number of years, I always appreciated his vocabulary. Gene Hart, who I was around in Philadelphia for a number of years as a co-broadcaster with the Flyers, had a love for the hockey and an enthusiasm for hockey that I think was infectious, and that's why the fans loved him. And it was hard to not be around, or to be around him and not catch the enthusiasm. that he had. I'd say those are the three that influenced me the most.
And you know, growing up in this area along the St. Clair River, we were fortunate back with the original six to have Hockey Night in Canada beamed in every Saturday night. And it was interesting to us, especially with Montreal, but at the time there were many French Canadian players, and we all knew how to say Jean Beliveau and Yvan Cournoyer, etc. But now with the Europeans and the Russians, and I understand you are the charter founder of the NHL pronunciation league, or what? Tell us about that.
Well, that was, I attended a meeting of the Broadcasters Association in Montreal. Dick Irvin, the legendary broadcaster, is still our executive secretary. And Chuck Caton, who's the broadcaster from Detroit area originally, who has done the Hartford Whalers since 1979 and now the Carolina Hurricanes. He and I were at the meeting. He was made president. I was made vice president. We brought up the notion of every time we go into a rink, we ask the broadcaster how the players on his team say their names. How about we do that in the fall in training camp for not only the players that are going to make the team, but the ones that aren't, that might be called up, and then we'll do it phonetically like they do on the UPI style book. And Dick says, that's a great idea, Mike, you do it. So that started us, and we did that for 20 years. Then during the lockout in 04-05, the league got the idea of doing it electronically by holding a microphone in front of the player. Makes sense. Have him say his name the way he wants it said. And then it was sent to Toronto and they did it. So for 20 years, that was the standard. We got a lot of phone calls at our house and it was left on the answering machine and they would read, the announcer would read the pronunciations and I would translate them into phonetics and we would publish the guide in time for the opening game. That was how it was done.
Perfect. Let's talk Olympics for a couple of minutes. You lost track of your Stanley Cup finals, and your Olympics are probably the same, 6, 7, 8 Olympics you've had the pleasure of calling? 8.
8, yeah, 2 summers and 6 winters.
And you've done men and women?
Yes.
Well, let's talk men first.
Sure.
Miracle on Ice, a bunch of collegians went out and beat the Russian Army team or whatever, but then probably in the last 20 years or so, has it been the NHL players for the most part?
Since 1998. Yeah, the first time in 92 and in 94, we had that rare time when the Olympics were every 4 years and it was winter and summer in the same year. Well, somebody got the idea, hey, we can make more money if we stagger it. So in 92 and 94, there were winter games. That was when the stagger began. And I got to work with Mike Eruzione, the hero of the 1980 team. He and John Davidson and I were the trio for CBS, and we had great fun, and they were all amateur hockey players. And there was a thrill that you saw in the eyes of the players when they came because this was their world stage, the biggest stage they had ever been on. That is still true with professionals today. It means a lot for them to play for their country, but it may or may not be the biggest stage they've ever been on because they've probably played in world championships or over in Europe for their national championships, or they've played for the Stanley Cup before. So it is not the same utter disregard for anything other than the pressure of representing your country like those kids had. We may get back to that sometime, maybe not amateurs, but maybe not to NHL players, depending on the decision that will be made in January about whether NHL players will go to South Korea or not. So we'll have to wait and see on that. It's in the negotiation stage right now.
And if that doesn't happen, they're going to have to scramble for a national team that is non-NHL, but theoretically they could be professional hockey players.
Right. Yeah, you're allowed to have pros. That changed in 1998 in hockey and really in all the other sports. But yes, you probably would have some very good American Hockey League players if professionals were allowed to go from the American Hockey League. I think they probably would be. But those are all things that we would have to cross as a bridge over the 12 months that would lead up to the games in South Korea.
Give us a little thought on the caliber of hockey with the women's Olympic team.
Well, for Canada and the United States, it gets better every Olympics. I was blessed to be in Nagano to see the U.S. women win the first game, first Olympics ever. defeating Canada in the gold medal game. And that was the first international tournament that the U.S. had ever beaten Canada. And talking to members of the U.S. team in the years that have followed, and as they think back to that golden night when they beat Canada and won the gold medal and heard the Star-Spangled Banner, they said, we got so tired of wearing the silver and listening to O Canada. It's a nice song, but we got so tired of hearing it because they always beat us. And that time, we not only beat them in the preliminary round decisively, but we won the gold medal game. Now, since that time, they've not. Canada has been dominant ever since that time. But the caliber of the United States and the Canadian women's teams have gotten better and better as the years have gone on, and I don't see it ever getting anything other than better as the years go on.
So you think the
more
future of women's hockey is more colleges are involved? And
right. One thing that has raised a question in the minds of the IIHF is that it winds up being a two-team tournament because the other nations have not progressed as quickly as the United States and Canada. But it's still worth doing. It's going to be done again, and I think for that reason, you have to think that there will be women's hockey in the Olympics indefinitely, unless there is a movement afoot to let the U.S. and Canada play best of 7. I think it'd be tremendous.
No, that would be. We wouldn't call it the Stanley Cup.
No, it would have to be something like that. But just let the two play for the gold, but that would remove a lot of athletes from Finland and Sweden and Switzerland that are very good and would want the chance to compete.
Well, you know, we in the United States and this area as well as others, Miracle on Ice, when Al Michaels made that great call back in 1980, when, as you say, Mike Eruzione and the rest of the amateurs took down Russia. And it was interesting, kind of like my Collinsworth quote, in 2010 you were in Vancouver for the Olympics, and somebody had said to Al Michaels, Al, it's a 30-year anniversary of your great call. Shouldn't you be calling the hockey? And he said, absolutely not. He says, I want to sit back and listen to Mike Emrick make the call. He's the guy that really does it well. And I think there's just a few things that, a couple accolades, but I want our people, our listeners at home to know you're not just the guy at Neiman's or the Voyager, but you are so well respected, within this country and within Sports Illustrated Man of the Media Person of the Year a couple of years ago. You're in the Hockey Hall of Fame. Who are a couple of people that maybe influenced you along the way in your life? Who do you look at?
There are so many, and I've been trying to hook up with them for the last 3 years by letter. I always think that if you write something down, and people don't get mail anymore, they don't get personal letters anymore. So I started about 3 years ago trying to find as many people as possible that have made a difference, and it's well over 200 now. The USPS needs the money. So you buy the stamps, and I was doing one a day. And once you exhaust the Christmas card list and all of those other things, they needed to hear the difference they made, whether they knew that they did or not. So as a result, I can't answer your question without reading a phone book to you. But there have been a great number. I think that anybody that winds up in this line of work has to have somebody pretty special that enables them to do the work. I had encouraging parents. I had a brother who has been a fan of mine and an encourager for years. And I have a wife, Joyce, who I met in 1974. We've been married 38 years. And you have to have someone who enables you to do your work and concentrate and keeps the wolves of distraction from your door. And that's a very important role, especially when you're dealing with high-profile work, where you really aren't allowed too many mistakes, and you're not really allowed to have too many bad games. And so there is a pressure that you put on yourself, and you have to have somebody that's very understanding to ride along with you and absorb some of that pressure and deal with it. And so I have a very special lady there.
Great.
So there are a number of people through the years, but those are some that I would focus on because I've known them longer than most.
Mike, you're all over the country with your broadcasts. You're all over the world with your Olympics. You're in and out of Metro Airport probably 2, 4, 5 times a week. Why do you live in St. Clair?
Well, I wound up coming here to work in 1973. I met Joyce in 1974. I realized that she had family here. My family was in Indiana, but I liked the area. I liked seeing the freighters go by and sounding their horns in the fog. And there were nice restaurants here and nice people here, and they cared about hockey here. And so those were a few things right away that I liked about the place. And moved away to Portland in 1977 and encouraged her to join me in 1978. So we got married and she moved out there. And we both had a longing to come back more than that 1 week that we got from the Flyers in the summer, and thought that I'd have to retire someday and we'd be old and come back here then. But the fortunate thing was that I got a job with the networks, and the networks don't care where you live. And so even though it's an hour and 10 minutes to the airport, this is home to us. And so this is where we are.
Great. How do you want to be remembered?
As a guy that liked dogs.
I know you have dogs. Yeah.
Oh, we've had them off and on for, 15 years? I don't know. I let other people decide. I don't have any concept of what a legacy would be. I suppose at 70 I should have that. I don't have a concept of that. Joyce likes me, the dogs like me, that's good. I like that. I enjoy getting in free to hockey games. They give you a good seat. You get to work with great athletes, and twice a month they send you something in the mail. Most times it arrives on time.
We talked a little bit before our taping about Vin Scully, the Dodger broadcaster who just called his last game probably about a month or two ago now at age 89. And it just happened Vin had sent you a message just before we went on the air today. But is Doc Emrick going to do this till he's 89 years old?
God willing, I would make 89 still alive. Yeah. But no, it's not that that baseball is doable. Vin did it up to age 88. Ernie Harwell was, I believe, 90 when he called his last game. For me, the way I call hockey, I think it's a challenge that eventually the motor skill, you have to think down the road, is going to be where I'm not going to be comfortable with my performance. I'm not there yet, but you have to foresee that that's probably going to be sometime. And NBC has wonderfully said, you decide when you want to quit. So that's a blessing that most people don't get. There'll be a time, sure. And I have a couple of people in my life who are going to help me if I'm not realistic enough to see that.
Well, and it's interesting, there was a HBO special that you were on. I don't know if it was Andy or Kramer or who it was.
That's right.
Was it Andy?
Yes.
And they did one of your hockey games, and they determined that during the course of that game, you used 150 different verbs for the movement of the puck. So I just want to say to our listening audience at home, Doc is the real Doc with that PhD in communications, but I can see at some point, if anybody has watched you do a game, you don't stop. And I think at one point during that interview, you mentioned the time where there wasn't a whistle for 13 or 14 minutes in one game you were doing, and that would take some phenomenal physical skills to keep up with.
I do have people that I work with, and Eddie Olczyk sits alongside, and he has a very good way of dropping in a few words and allowing me to catch my breath. So I'm very fortunate to have those people. But thank you for mentioning
Mike,
that.
we're really a pleasure to have you as our guest today. And for our listeners at home, you will be able to see this interview. And if you want to tape it, you can go to our website, watchctv.org. Click on shows, click on conversations, and you'll be able to send this interview to whatever hockey fan you have throughout the world. But it's been our pleasure here to have Mike Emrick as our guest. And if you, in our listening audience, know of someone in our community that you think would make a viable guest on our show, please contact us at watchctv.org, Cable Channel 6, downtown St. Clair. Thanks.
You've been watching Conversations with Tom Shorkey. Conversations explores the past, the present, and the future of the communities in which we live through the eyes of interesting individuals. If you have an idea for a future conversation, please contact us at www.watchctv.org. Thanks for watching Conversations with Tom Shorkey.